Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our latest webinar tonight. We're very excited to have a very special guest with us tonight. We've got Barbara Barker coming in from ARACY offices in Canberra. If you want to give us a wave, Barb, let us know.
Hello.
Hello. Great to have you here tonight. Also,
Thank you.
And we're really looking forward to, well, Susanna will be talking with you in conversation later on in this webinar, which will be a real highlight. We also have in the room my colleague, Susanna Schofield, and she's the Associate Director leading up this work on the guidance report that we'll be speaking about tonight on engaging parents. And also in the room we have Dr. Pauline Ho, who will be running on our chat box tonight. So feel free to put any questions through that you have, and we'll answer them as we go, and also we'll have a question time as well. So let's make a start. I know that we have people joining us from all over Australia tonight, and great to have you all on board across every state and territory. I think we had registrations.
We did.
And
the US.
And the US as well.
Yeah,
wow.
A few far afield.
We are international tonight, people. Fabulous. All right, fantastic. So we ourselves here are meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and we pay our respects to the elders of the Kulin Nation and our elders past, present, and most importantly, those emerging. And you'll be on different lands throughout Australia, and you can pay respect to those. Great. So here are the people that we have with us tonight. We have Barbara Barker, and there we have the Twitter handle as well for Barbara, and the ARACY handle as well. So feel free to tweet out tonight if you would like to. And then in the middle, someone fairly familiar to myself, me, and then on the far right, Susanna. So great to have us all here tonight. Of course, we are from Evidence for Learning. Now, we've introduced ourselves, so we would really love to hear from you and where you are coming in from tonight. So if you can let us know what's your role, where are you joining us from, and so type it into the chat box. If you feel comfortable, let everyone know. If not, you can just let us know as well. So start popping that into the chat. Really good to find out who's here. So I'm speaking on a dual lens tonight, from being the grateful role of being a parent and also an educator. So I'm carrying both those loads today, and similarly for Barbara as well. So nice to speak from both those lines. Hi. Good to have you here. All right. Thank you for joining us from Newcastle. Fantastic. Great, WA. Good on you. What time is it there? I think it's 4:30, 4? Somewhere around there. Oh, Tasmania. Awesome. Whereabouts in Tasmania? Sorry. I always get distracted by the chat box.
Yeah, I can see why. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it's nice. Tassie. Oh, awesome. We've got 2 Tassies. Fantastic. Oh, great. Great to have you there from Perth, researcher from Edith Cowan University. Great. Great. Charles Stewart University. Fantastic. Thank you for joining us here tonight. We've got a nice and varied group. Great. A teacher from Victoria. Probably not far away from us here in Melbourne. All right, so what we're going to do, which we always do, and you keep sharing where you're from, and everyone will come back to you. We're going to do a little quiz for you, just to keep you awake on this Tuesday night. So first question, and type it into, you should be able to see that poll right in front of you now. So let us know how many months of impact on average could be expected from parental engagement, and we're talking about in the primary and high school setting here specifically. So let us know what you think. Is it 1 month, is it 3 months, or is it 5 months? There we go. People are starting to enter. Fantastic. And then the next question, Oh, we've got a bit of a race going on between 3 and 5 months. It's really exciting here, a bit of a nail biter. And then question number 2 as well, we've got which of the following best describes examples from practice from the highest impact to the lowest impact. That's based on effect sizes. And we've got A, which is shared reading, checking homework, text messages to parents. B, checking homework, shared reading, text messages to parents, or text messages to parents, shared reading, and checking homework. Checking homework. That does happen a lot in life in your parent. All right, I'm about to press the end polling button. Have we got a couple more people that want to just quickly jump in? All right, I'll press the button. Good. Yep, looking good. Good participation. Thanks. Oh, nice. We did just get a little jump. Thank you. All right, end polling should be coming up on your screen pretty much now. So, yes, you have all done your homework. So, +3 months got the majority of the votes, and that is correct. That's the average effect size, and we'll be looking at some of the variation that sits underneath that effect size tonight, which is quite exciting. I love one of those graphs. And we'll also with question number 2 as well, you've all 60% of you have answered A, which yes, shared reading first, checking homework second, and text messages to parents third. And we know that parental engagement in general is more effective at a younger age, and it could be based around the activities. And I'm sure Barb will have an opinion on that as well. All right. So thank you everyone for participating in that polling. That's great. What we'll do now, let's have a little look at the overview. So what we'll be covering tonight. So we'll be firstly looking at a publication that's just come out with Teacher Magazine today. Hot off the press from both of us, really. We'll first be looking at some of the main points that we make in that. Then we'll have a quick jump on to the Teaching and Learning Toolkit and just explore parental engagement there. Then we'll be jumping to look at our parental engagement guidance report, which will be coming out at about end of this month, end of this month, excitedly. And then most importantly, we'll have a conversation with Barbara. So, and then we'll have questions from you all. So that's great. Let's get started. So we know that, as you've just found out in the quiz as well, that engaging parents in the learning of their children can be a really effective means to improve students' learning. We know that it can add an average of 3 months worth of learning progress. We'll have a look at the different effect sizes that sit underneath that mean weighted effect size. And really important within this is to consider what is the age of the child, and thus what are some appropriate activities to be teaching your parent body in how to engage with their child to get the best possible results for that child. So for younger children, shared reading with open and closed questions can be a really useful approach. With older children, important to look at helping them monitoring their homework and scaffolding that rather than directly doing the homework, as tempting as that may be from a parental perspective. And also what else we published in this article was we were looking at personalised school communication, and that's been found to have a significant impact on children's learning and attendance. So I've got a phone up there because there was a study from the EEF, which is our parent organisation, our sister organisation, the Education Endowment Foundation out of London. And they did a large randomised control trial looking at texting to parents. And what they found was that if the texts were directed and personalised to the student, they did see an improvement in students' learning. And what they've done a lot of randomised control trials in the parental engagement space. And this was one of the few that actually did result in a lift in albeit a small lift of plus 1 month's worth of learning in students' mathematics classes and results. So that was quite exciting finding. So what we'll do now, we'll just jump on to the live site and you guys can click along with me. So that should be coming up for you now. All right, are we on the live site? Put your hands up if we can see the live site. Should be able to see the live site, yeah? All right, great. So if we just, thank you very much. Awesome. Beautiful. Perfect. All right, so if we have a look, these are our toolkits here. So we just recently published the Early Childhood Education Toolkit. This does present evidence in looking at parental engagement in children from age 2 to 5, and that has a mean effect size that is average of plus 4 months of learning progress. We won't go into that today, but that resource is freely available on our site today. Let's jump into the Teaching and Learning Toolkit, because we know that primarily the vast majority of our audience today are focused in at the school age. And if we just scroll down to parental engagement, fantastic. We can see the headline figures there. We've got a fairly high-ish average cost. Our overall security is quite good. So we've got 3 out of 5 padlocks, and our month's worth of impact is quite strong as well. So that's just our headline figures. Probably the most important bit to focus in on here with the Teaching and Learning Toolkit is the what should I consider section. Gives you the most practical information, but we've moved that even further into practice with the guidance report that Susanna will be talking you through very soon. So these are our references here, and this shows you what papers were actually involved in the calculation of the weighted mean effect size there of the 0.22, which we've translated into 3 months worth of learning progress. And you can also click through to, oh, that's one of my favorites, all of the different readings available. And also what we have sitting underneath there is our Australasian research summary. This was compiled by Melbourne Graduate School of Education. What they did, they looked at the research for the past 6 years in parental engagement in Australia and New Zealand, and have summarised that neatly here and have the references at the bottom as well if you want to look at specifically what research we have within the Australian and New Zealand context. So if we just jump back onto the presentation now, and what we can see here, so this is one of my favourite graphs to produce really. Along the bottom we can see the effect sizes, and up the side I've just made them in alphabetical order. So if you look at them, you can see, have a look at the depth and the variety between all those different effect sizes. And even something, there's the same author there as well. We've got Jens, and he's in there 4 times. And very different effect sizes we can see. And you can see the 2015 one was focused in on just father involvement, while the 2007, that was urban secondary schools, the 2012 was urban schools, and the 2005 was urban primary schools. So it's really interesting, just even the same author looking at slightly different collections of literature based around one specific area of parental engagement can get such varied results. And I think there's a real richness in looking at that greater detail at the teaching and learning toolkit.
So I'm going to jump in here with a little bit of an overview of some of our guidance reports, and then we'll look at some of the detail that's come out of this. So Evidence for Learning have produced and published 2 guidance reports up until this point. So our first one earlier in the year about implementation and how we can encourage and support schools to do implementation in a really constructive way. The second one, which we released, and I know some of you were on our webinar about a month ago, looking at how do we support schools to work with their teaching assistants in a really productive way. And really excited that our next foray into guidance reports is support for schools about how to work with parents, particularly where the link through is to student learning outcomes. So just to give a bit of background, this report is work that we have taken from the Evidence Endowment Foundation in the UK, and we're currently in the process of translating this for the Australian audience. So everything you're seeing today is in draft. Everything you're seeing is kind of, this is the first time we've shared it more broadly than this. And so some of the actual concepts and things we've put together just for the purpose of this webinar. We're inviting feedback at this point. We're working with the team at ARACY, with Barb and her colleagues, and a couple of other groups to contextualise this further for the Australian landscape, and we'll be finishing that work in the next couple of weeks so that we can get this to you before Cup Weekend, so you can all have something to read and have a nice break. I know you'll be excited mid-November to be doing that. So this is just a little bit of a precursor that we're sharing this with you in the hopes that actually we'll get some really good feedback and that we'll be able to test a few of these ideas with you. All of our guidance reports, the ones that we've already published and the ones that we're working with, contain between 1 and 8 recommendations, and the recommendations are tailored to school leaders. So while we acknowledge that there's going to be secondary audiences definitely to those things, they're really written in a way that we hope school leaders will pick up and adopt for their context, but appreciate as well the evidence that's sitting behind them. The 4 recommendations that we're about to go through now are based on a lot of evidence that has come out of the UK and internationally as well, but out of the Evidence Endowment Foundation in the UK. And we're going to walk through them just one at a time to give you a bit of a high-level overview of what sits underneath them. And then we'll just jump into a conversation with Barb to add a little bit of context around how this is interpreted in the Australian space as well. Recommendation 1 is critically review how you work with parents. This is a really overarching one, and it's sort of the starting point for the guidance report, so this is why it comes first. There is no one-size-fits-all approach, and we acknowledge that. There's a good indication, though, of what works. So this is and all of the guidance needs to be taken with context, understanding that teachers and school leaders bring a great deal of professional practice to this space, and they know their context better than anyone and their community better than anyone. But hopefully these are applicable approaches across all schools in Australia. Be optimistic about the potential of working with parents, and I think that this one is probably a given. We understand that this often is how we work, but it kind of goes to the next point, where there's mixed evidence on what works and what doesn't work and in what context. So actually it comes down to a lot of, you actually need to evaluate this as you're rolling it out in your schools, and you can't do that without working with students and parents as well. And critically review the aims of your current approaches. So what is the purpose of parental engagement in your context? This particular guidance report really has a strong focus on to improve student learning, but there are many other reasons why you would have parental engagement as a focus in your school. Certainly learning outcomes is probably a secondary thing for a lot of schools who just want to engage their families and make sure that they're feeling safe. So it's getting them through that gate in a really meaningful way so that we can then start to work with parents to engage or to further engage in student learning. Our second recommendation here is around providing practical strategies to support learning at home. And I think the key takeaway here is this is really dependent on the age of the student. So as Tanya mentioned before, in primary school, actually shared reading is a really constructive way to be working with parents. At secondary school, there might be things like setting up study habits that parents can really influence, making sure there's a safe working space and routine and those things that require a little bit of less intervention on the work front, but a lot more around routine and structure. Making the actual activities, such as reading, more effective by giving opportunities for parents to have those further conversations. So actually providing sheets, and we've seen some schools do really lovely things around sort of development for their parent group so that they know that they can actually have those deep conversations and push a bit harder with their students and link that back to learning in the classroom if that's relevant as well. So setting up positive routines to encourage strong habits, that's a particularly poignant one when we get to the pointy end of the school up at secondary, but actually is pretty important the whole way through. And one of the other things that's an area of promise, not so much coming out of Australian research, we haven't quite kind of bought that bridge yet, but in the UK, summer reading initiatives in all different forms are showing really good gains, just because that we're seeing that the gap or the slide back of student achievement over the big long breaks that they have. So that's a bit of a one to watch, but we think that that's quite promising, and some of the research coming out of the EEF suggests that as well. Our third recommendation is around tailoring school communication to encourage positive dialogue about learning. Again, I think this is a really exciting space because it's moved a lot in the last 10 years even. It bases the principle around well-designed communication as an effective way to improve attainment and attendance. And those two things are really well linked. So actually they see where they can encourage parents to work on attendance, attainment follows. These types of communications are generally pretty low cost, straightforward, and often an easy entry for parents where they might have had a bad experience with schooling in their own childhood, or have other barriers such as work and things which don't allow them to kind of be in the school, which is the case for so many parents now. Two-way communication, and this is, I can't emphasise enough the importance of building this in. It's really important that that trusting relationship allows parents to feel like they're being heard and to feel like they've got an opportunity to give feedback. We haven't done a lot of this study in Australia, but in the UK they did a really widespread study of parents' engagement in their school, and about 50% of parents were consistently saying, we get communication, but we're not actually asked to provide feedback, or we're not asked for our opinion. We don't feel like we have anything to sort of give back, which is just not the case. And tailoring messages for groups of parents where necessary. So this again goes back to the age issue, but also across your school there are groups of parents who you might be able to engage through different activities to get them through the door. Particularly, I'm thinking of some really great examples that I've seen in Western Sydney around different language groups of parents. There's some really wonderful work happening out there that we'd love to highlight down the line as well. So this is a really great space. I think it's being made a lot easier by a lot of the tools out there that are allowing parents to be engaged in the sort of day-to-day of school life when they are at work and have other commitments. And so this is one of the things that I think that falls into that we should be really optimistic about this bucket. And finally, I'm going to flick across to recommendation 4. So this, again, I've touched a little bit on some of the things that relate to our fourth recommendation, offering more sustained and intensive support where it's needed. This could be many, many forms. So we encourage the first step to be talk to parents and understand what would help them to support learning. and plan with their needs in mind. I think the prime example is sort of parent-teacher interviews that are set for 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, parent consultations that exclude a group of working parents or parents who might have shift work and other commitments. So that's really about knowing your context and being able to tailor things around who you're working with. Communication should start with the premise that parents are equal partners in learning. This is particularly important in this sustained intensive support because we really need to make sure that this isn't interpreted as where we see parents are disengaged, that we need to offer them more or we need to reach out to them, because it's not always about that. There's some terrific examples here from the Northern Territory who have got families as first teachers programs, some really excellent work happening across there as well. And some really basic stuff around establishing an expectation to encourage a consistent approach to behaviour, things that are fairly simple, things that will translate from home to school and will also give a sort of shared language across the school gates. So those are our 4 recommendations in a fairly quick summary, but I just wanted to share those with you so that you've got a little bit of an idea about what's coming out in the next guidance report, keeping in mind that this is all draft at the moment and we haven't got our final rounds of feedback incorporated into this. But we really would appreciate any thoughts and feedback that you have as school leaders and who are practicing in this area every day. But for now, I'm really delighted to introduce and welcome Barb Barker from ARACY, Australian Research Alliance for Children and Youth, who has been one of our partners in this work and is reviewing some of this currently. But Barbara comes with a pretty extensive background in this area and has worked across a number of jurisdictions, has really been leading ARACY's work on parental engagement, which is quite a deep piece of work now, and she's going to talk a little bit about that. So Barb, we're absolutely delighted that you've been able to join us and provide your expertise in this area. We've got a few questions that we're going to put to you, but we'd also encourage others to jump in and we'll make sure we leave some time for questions at the end so that we can answer those. So either through the chat box or through the Q&A, please feel free to reach out to us. But Barb, maybe we'll just start with a little bit about what ARACY does in this space, a little bit of background about ARACY for, I think it will be relatively familiar to a lot of people on the line, but some of the emerging work perhaps they won't have heard about.
Fantastic. Well, firstly, I'd like to say thank you so much for inviting me to speak tonight. And as you rightly said, we have been immersed in this work for some time. So I hope I don't ramble on too long. You'll need to be strict with me and keep me succinct. But a little bit about ARACY before we begin. As the name suggests, we are a research alliance. So alliance is at the sort of centre of what we do, and what that means is that we work with others to really try and improve the outcomes of children and young people in Australia. The wellbeing of kids is at the heart of what ARACY does, and I guess unfortunately an organisation like ARACY needs to exist because our kids aren't doing as well as they should be doing in a wealthy country like ours. So we need to work together as researchers and service providers and policy makers if we're going to change this. But essentially we work on translating the evidence into practice more systematically, and we aim to do this by working with others to advocate for system-wide evidence-based improvements. So some very similar kinds of lines to what you guys are aiming to achieve as well through evidence for learning. We're quite unique in making the link between all areas of wellbeing for young Australians, and we do that through our wellbeing framework. Some people will have heard of that. It's called the NEST, and it's Australia's first evidence-based framework for national child and youth wellbeing, which is focused across 6 wellbeing domains. So our shared vision for Australia's youth and children and youth, so that's for the ages 0 to 24, or even before birth really, in the womb, is an Australia where all young people are loved and safe. That's our first domain. That they have material basics, that they're healthy, that they're learning and participating, and that they have a positive sense of identity and culture. And that vision applies to all Australian children, of course, and youth, regardless of age, gender, ability, ethnicity, race, and socioeconomic status. So, yeah, that's a bit about ARACY.
I might jump in. Like, we're obviously, for all of the reasons Barb mentioned, really delighted to have ARACY as a contributor on this particular project, given the expertise and the balanced view that they bring as well. I know that in your work, and I think for all of the people on the line, there's quite an acknowledgement that parental engagement is a really huge area of priority for our schools. I think one of the things that we've found in conversations with you, Barb, and others, we're seeing that actually the research in Australia, and particularly the research that links parental engagement to outcomes for students, academic outcomes, is still yet to sort of emerge, or just emerging. From your own work, can you describe any of the trends that you're seeing come out at the moment? Any of the sort of the research that's starting to appear?
Sure. I mean, I think just going back to your question there around there's an acknowledgement of parent engagement as a priority, and I think you're right. I think it is acknowledged that it is important, and perhaps it's a priority, but I would also argue that it's still seen as a bit of an optional by some schools, and I think there's a few reasons for that. And I think it probably impacts on why the evidence base is a bit slim. So I think it's worth touching on a couple of issues there, and I'd like to just sort of talk about those before I go on. I think definition of what you guys are calling parental engagement, what we would probably call parent engagement or family engagement in learning. We've had some pushback from some in the community that parent or parental, they didn't identify themselves in that. So we've been conscious to move towards family, but I mean, labels aside, I think there's a little bit of a question mark sometimes still over what we're talking about when we use that term family engagement in learning. And I won't go into a lot of it now, but I think traditionally, historically, there's been a belief that the role of families in schools was to be involved in the running of schools and to be involved in participating at meetings or volunteering or being a part of, a committee of some sort. But there's actually very little evidence to show that has an impact on learning outcomes of children. And so what we're more interested in is the engagement of families in their child's learning, as you rightly say. But from our research that we've done over many years now, well over 5 years, I still come across some reluctance from some schools to be open to anything more than involvement from families. And there's still not a lot of understanding of how we can harness all that families bring to the learning of their children and young people. The other thing I think that's interesting is that there's no set way. So you talked about before, it really needs to be tailored to the context that it's in. And I think it's therefore quite likely to look different from school to school, and something, again, that's tailored. So for a school, for example, I'll give you a couple of examples. For a school that might have a large, say, Indigenous population, an element of their family engagement work might be around, say, harnessing the resources in their community to change how they deliver the national curriculum. So, for example, incorporating Indigenous knowledge systems into school life. I've also come across, for example, a strong agricultural community down in South Victoria, and they're very much about harnessing the knowledge of local farming and other agricultural families to build applied learning experiences in the classroom at a range of year levels. So everyone is working together to not only improve the kids' learning, but to build community capacity, to reduce isolation, to increase cohesion, that sort of thing. I think another thing is that there isn't really a compliance aspect for family engagement. To be really successful, we know it needs to be embedded in formal structures like school planning. And the improvement context for schools doesn't always prioritise family engagement. So there's also professional standards, as we know. We've got the professional standards for teachers and for principals, and they certainly do cover aspects of parent and family engagement. But so there is an imperative there for educators to develop and to progress their practice in family engagement. But otherwise, it's fairly easy for it to slip off the radar, particularly in a busy environment like a school where there's just so many competing priorities. And just finally, I think there's still a little bit of a sense that it boils down to relationships, that, you know, it does, let's not deny that it does, but I think in saying that, it's easy to think about family engagement in highly personalised terms. So it's just about getting along with people, you know. It's easy, you know, you just have to care a bit. And for those who don't care, they're not really engaged in their kids' learning. Well, I think in thinking that it's that we forget that actually it's something that is complex and it's challenging, and it requires appropriate resources and structures in place at a range of levels in order for it to succeed. So yeah, so it's definitely challenging. But just to go back, you did ask me about trends. So just quickly, a couple of trends that we're seeing. Some of the more interesting things are along things like clusters of schools working together. So it's very difficult for a school to act as a microcosm and not take in the learnings from elsewhere. So it's really lovely when I see schools working as clusters, either to support things like transitions with their families through sort of feeder schools up to a secondary school, or to see professional learning happening across schools. You know, there's stuff happening there which is really exciting. As you mentioned before, at a classroom and perhaps year level, we're seeing a lot of digital platform work emerging. They're growing in popularity, and of course they don't override or take the place of a personal contact and the one-on-one relationship factor that I think families may search for. And of course it means staff need to be really well trained in what they're doing with their particular platform, the chosen platform, to really harness what it can provide families. But we see that they are really beneficial in scaffolding that opportunity for families to have conversations with their children in the car, at the dinner table, or wherever that beautiful stuff happens that we call family engagement in learning. And I think also what we're seeing now is in terms of whole school planning, we're starting to see schools considering all of the programs that they have in place, and where aspects like family engagement are relevant to the priorities across different programs. So it becomes possible to prioritise sort of the common goals across different programs that they might have in a school, and think about the best use of resources to increase the effectiveness of those goals, but also to reduce the burden on staff, on educators, having to think about achieving priorities across a number of programs.
Can I jump in? I wanted to go back to something you said, because it went to my next question actually, which is really to focus in on the relationship side of things, and understanding that complexity, because I think for a lot of the question, or a lot of the recommendations that we've outlined through the guidance report at the moment, there is sort of an understanding that before we even get to that stage, the school have somehow got parents through the gate so that they can begin having those conversations about what a good study technique looks like, or how you would develop some questioning with your child to help them in shared reading.
Yep.
Have you seen some really promising examples of schools that have built those relationships in a really deliberate way?
Yeah, I have. And obviously a lot of this stuff comes down to the school type. So if you're an early learning centre, or if you're a primary school, or if you're dealing with older students in the secondary school phase, it depends on the age and the stage of students. We're hearing more schools talk about the fact that they need to have many doors or many ways in. So what I mean by that is perhaps sort of being aware that building up to a big event, one big event, it may not be the thing that ticks the box. It may not work. But instead, what might be more effective is finding a range of ways that are informal, that just give a chance for families to think, yeah, that's going to work for me. That way will work, not that other big thing. And so having that personal contact, that's something that applies to their child. So we know that personal contact really makes an impact, and what that impact is for their child. And then having that link to learning is the key thing. But I think, for example, we know that getting off on the right foot early seems to be a really important step, finding out about the families in the class, so taking the time to meet with them face-to-face or on the phone. We've heard about teachers sending home a postcard before school begins for the year. Just letting that family know that, hey, I really care about you and I'm looking forward to the year ahead. You know, that just gets that positive step in the right direction in early. Teachers asking families to fill in a get to know your child template, and then letting that form the basis of a conversation when they get to meet face-to-face or again on the phone. I mean, obviously in the high school setting, things are trickier. Teachers have more students. But I think there are options there for getting in early and setting things up positively before the year gets underway. I've certainly heard about form teachers taking on a lot of that work, because it can be difficult for the classroom teacher to be able to call 100 or so families. But I think that's still something that schools are, see as a big priority. We've obviously heard also about home visits to families, and I know this is an area that's kind of mooted a little bit. I don't know that there's much of that happening in Australia. We certainly have heard about it over in the US, and we're really interested in unpacking that a bit more for our context here. I mean, the international evidence suggests that makes a big difference, particularly among communities that are underserved or that are facing disadvantage, communities where families may have baggage that comes, relates to when they were at school and things like that. And what we've seen and heard about in these studies from the States is that it sends a really strong message that the school and the teacher really care about that family, and they care about the children in their class, they care about building community. So I think there's, some interesting lines there that we could be following up here. But I think, a lot of this comes down to trialling things and reviewing how it goes. There's no point in doing things if they don't work. Schools don't have time and place for that. We know that. So we talk about the importance of schools evaluating how effective their parent and family engagement practices are, and if they're not working, to try something else and to get feedback from families and to do something with that feedback.
Thank you. I'm so fascinated to hear about your take on particularly their home visits, which is quite a phenomenon elsewhere, and which I haven't seen much of in the Australian context either. I think that highlights a little bit about sort of our or Australia's sort of lack of trialling in this space. I'm interested to know from sort of research if you think that there's other gaps, and I think you talked a little bit earlier about the sort of gap of secondary school and sort of some good examples of where that's being overcome.
Yeah.
So have you seen other gaps in the research that actually is something that we need to be called on here as sort of people within the education sector who do have a little bit of control over what can be trialled and what can be tested?
Yeah.
what schools can actually start researching and trialling in their own context, which is just as valuable, if not more so, for actually finding some new ways forward in this space.
Yeah, we've been spending the last little bit of time we've been working on a project for 4 years now with the Australian government. It was funded by the Australian government. And that was about building the profile of family engagement and exploring options for consistent approaches to measuring the effects of family engagement, and also to build and share evidence. And most recently, we've been working on a toolkit, which will be something it's designed for school communities to think about the practical guidance of how they can embed some of these structures in their schools. And I think where we're seeing gaps is really around that guidance for schools to know how to embed this stuff so it becomes a cultural aspect of the school. It's something we call kind of relationship-based engagement, really, and the how-to around whole school planning, because I think there's a real gap there. It's a bit random. Instead of being acknowledged that this is a process, it's a journey, it's not a one-off event, it's not a series of events or feel-good activities. It's really got to be embedded in the core of what the school is doing. And that's not an easy thing if that's something that schools haven't been, set up to do in the past. It's not something they need to comply to. There's, this is what I was mentioning before about continuous improvement. We would like to see that bedded down in that school planning cycle. And I think there's also a bit of a gap when it comes to what this means for school staff. And I use very carefully the word staff, because it's not only the teachers themselves, it's anyone who comes into contact with families needs to be conscious of just how big an impact they can have on the way that families perceive or receive the messages that come from the school. So particularly, front desk is a classic. And I think we need to think about options for capacity building there with staff. We've looked into this a little bit with, we did some work with the Australian Council for Deans of Education. And we know that there's some coursework starting to come through around family engagement, but typically there hasn't been a lot. We know that teachers don't receive explicit training in this stuff, and that comes back to that idea that it's just relationships, you kind of, some are receiving training, but not many, and it comes over time with on-the-job training. So typically your more experienced teachers may guide and mentor more junior teachers, and that's fantastic. Teachers can't possibly learn everything in Teachers College, but we know that the capacity needs to be built there. And I think there's a little bit of a gap there around sustainability of efforts. So just what I was saying before, how it's not a journey. It's a journey, it's not an event. And actually it never ends, does it? So unfortunately, we can't tick a box and say, great, that's done, we are set. Because, every new year brings a new cohort of families, perhaps new teachers, children change as they develop through the ages and stages, so we need to respond to those different needs. And there's a lot there. So we need to provide tools and resources for schools, and in our toolkit that's coming out, we'll have lots of case studies as well from wonderful things that are happening around the country. So that'll be coming out at the end of the year, so that's a bit of a plug for that.
We'll make sure that with our colleagues who are on the webinar tonight as well, that they get a heads up as soon as that's released from Evidence for Learning. I'm just interested to throw a couple of sort of final questions at you, Barb, but one of them was really throwing on the notion that you just talked about of sort of capacity building, but maybe a bit more broadly. So without wanting to suggest that there might be a silver bullet in there somewhere, is there one piece of practice that you've seen that actually might have some really positive effects if it's scaled up that currently hasn't been because of resource, or is it actually just a conversation of broader actually the prioritisation of the resources that sits behind it is the key to getting this moving?
Yeah, it's difficult. I think it probably boils down to a commitment by school leaders at that whole school level. So that the vision obviously needs to be there, but more than that, it's there's a commitment at the whole school level, and that means remembering that capacity building is key. So, I mean, I guess essentially we're talking about strong family-school relationships here, and for those to thrive, we need to accept that capacity building will need to happen on both sides. So some educators will need some help in that area, and some families will too. And so there needs to be a commitment to that. They both need the knowledge and the skills to work together, and schools need to purposefully integrate family engagement with the goal of students learning and thriving. I guess that's what systems thinking is really about. It's about creating that supportive environment that can make parent engagement a success. But if you think that just throwing funding, for example, at a school will make all the difference, well, that's not going to help, is it? Because we need to think about teachers having the training and the time and the resources. We need to see parents understanding that engaging in education is a really big part of their role, and that they may need some help or guidance if they've had negative experiences at school themselves. We need to get those messages right. So you were talking about that before, and I think that's really key. And there's even some new emerging research that's come out of the Frameworks Institute in the States, just like as we speak, in the last month or so, that's really talking about how to frame those messages well. And it's only at that point when we've got those things in place that we'll start to see the changes. So, no, Susanna, I'm sorry, I don't have one thing I'd like to.
We don't expect you to solve parental engagement for schools in an hour webinar, so you're off the hook on that. We'll give you a little bit more time. Just a reflection from me, and there's one question at least in the Q&A box, but please, if you've got other questions on the line, drop them in. One of the interesting things you spoke about just now is the idea of actually we need to upskill people in this area, like teachers, as part of their professional development, as part of their working towards their professional standards, and this is part of that and sort of explicitly built into it.
Yeah.
In the UK, there's some really good research to say that about 10% of teachers do some sort of professional development over any year in the area of parental engagement. Australia doesn't have that type of research, and there's a few people out there that do offer services like that, but the percentage is nowhere near. And so a lot of it appears to be fitting within schools providing their own professional development, which might be the case. It might not be something to respond to, just a reflection from me on struggling to find some more data about it here.
Yeah.
So one question, and this is a good one for you, because I think we'll put you on the spot.
Yeah.
An anonymous attendee has asked if there's any chance of a second ARACY parent engagement conference.
It's such a beautiful question. I'd love there to be, but yeah, there will be if you can find some funding for it. Absolutely. And I think there's a real there's a bit of a desire out there. We've had, because we've just passed the 2-year mark, I think there's been, we've had a few queries about it, and look, people didn't think it was that bad. We liked bringing that community of practice together. Yeah, so that was good.
It was an excellent conference.
Thank you. Yeah.
Can I ask if there's any more questions from our participants? We've got a couple of minutes left before we'll just do a quick wrap up. So I might just go back to the chat box if there's anything there. Just to mention, there's a few really interesting resources flying around the chat box, and I'm very pleased that this forum is being used in a way to share great examples of what you're seeing work. So thank you so much for being generous with your resources. Just another question as well, and Barb, we'll send this to you first. best ways to measure community engagement.
Mm.
Do you have any thoughts?
I guess it depends what the purpose of measuring it is. Yeah, I mean, you could a good measure would be, yeah, I mean, what are you seeing when you have community engagement? Ideally, you're seeing that there's a willingness there to be brought into, and there's a, I guess what I'm trying to say is there's a willingness and an understanding there that it takes a whole community to impact a child's learning. Yeah, so good community engagement, you can see that evidenced in the way that the school supports. It's open to bringing in, whether it be families or whether it be families and people in the community that aren't necessarily families. It's just evident in how the practice is delivered. You can see that. I don't know if I'm really helping though. I'm not sure how you would measure it.
No, that's great. I think it would be a similar advice to what we would have in terms of actually thinking through the implementation of what you're doing, what the goals are and what you're expecting to see, and which would lead to your sort of way of measuring. But an interesting thing that you said earlier, which I think also might provide some context, or maybe just something to think about for the person who asked the question, is that shift from involvement to engagement, which I think is a really nice way to sort of define, just are we shifting the narrative a little bit in our school context.
Yeah.
We've also had a comment from someone in New South Wales who has highlighted that actually, yes, the Tell Them From Me survey is a really terrific resource. I know that in particularly in New South Wales, there's been a big push this year to actually encourage parents, to help schools encourage parents to respond to that, and it's resulted in a much greater response rate, which is terrific. There are similar surveys in other states as well, so absolutely, if you've got that at your fingertips, then it's a really terrific piece of research which you conduct, but all of the methodology is designed for you. Barb, thank you so much for joining us. We are just delighted to have been able to spend this time with you, and for your generosity in sharing your evening with us in beautiful Canberra. I'm sure it's nice and light outside and you'll be keen to go for a walk. Just wanted to say thank you so much. We'll continue to carry on the conversation on Twitter as well. So if anyone wants to ask questions or has got reflections when they wake up tomorrow morning or in the middle of the night, please yell out. We just had a few reflections to prompt, I suppose, and these are from the teacher article that Tanya was talking about earlier. Considerations for teachers and leaders in thinking about this work of parent engagement. So I encourage you to have a look at these questions. We won't read them out to you because you absolutely can do that on your own. But please go back to the teacher article and have a look at these if you'd like to start the discussion with your staff at home. And to finish off, a bit of a call for if you would like to get in touch with us, we've got a number of ways for you to do that. Particularly around the guidance report on working with parents. I would be more than delighted to hear from anyone who was on the webinar tonight, or if you're watching this back later, to hear your comments on this draft work. We've got a webinar series, you know about this already. We'll be running another one in November, and so that's coming up quite quickly. We'll have a nice big break for you over Christmas and come back in February as well. You can subscribe to our e-news, evidenceforlearning.org.au. We're on Twitter and Facebook as per usual. And our guidance report will be published at the end of the month. The easiest way to find that, if you don't want to be clicking on the webpage every day, is to join up to our e-news, because that will be how we share that news with you all. We would like to thank everyone so much for joining us on your Tuesday evenings. It's a big commitment while you've got families and other at home waiting for you to finish work. So we're totally grateful for you to be giving this time for us. Thank you for the terrific comments. We're really looking forward to having a read through those. There will be a couple of questions at the end of this webinar as well. So if you take the time to please give us a little bit of feedback, we would absolutely love that as well. But we're going to sign off now with a huge thank you and to enjoy the rest of your weeks. good luck for the rest of term 4, and we hope that we will hear from you all again soon. Thanks very much, all.